There are places on Earth where human cruelty and natural hostility combine to create something uniquely terrible. Kolyma was one of them. Picture this. You are digging for gold in permafrost so hard that dynamite barely scratches it. The air temperature is cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, and your daily bread ration depends on meeting a quota that requires you to move several tons of frozen earth with hand tools while starving. The Soviet state called this corrective labor. The prisoners called it something else entirely. We are going to spend tonight in the coldest corner of the Gulag system, where approximately 1 million people died so the Kremlin could pay its bills in gold. Find somewhere warm. You will need it. Before we step into the cold, you need to understand the mathematics of your new existence. This is not a prison camp in any conventional sense. This is an equation, and you are one of the variables being solved for zero. Here is how it works. Your daily food ration is calculated based on the percentage of your work quota you completed the previous day. Meet 100% of your quota, and you receive approximately 700 grams of bread plus watery soup and perhaps a scrap of fish. Fall below 100%, and your ration shrinks. Fall below 50%, and you receive what is officially called the punishment ration, which amounts to roughly 300 grams of bread and soup that is more accurately described as hot water with memories of vegetables. Now here is the problem, and it is a significant one. Meeting 100% of your quota requires you to expend approximately 4,000 calories of energy per day. Swinging a pickaxe into frozen ground for 12 hours in temperatures that would kill exposed flesh in minutes is, it turns out, extremely demanding work. But your full ration, even at 100% quota fulfillment, provides only about 1,500 calories. Do you see the issue? The gap between what the work demands and what the food provides is approximately 2,500 calories per day. That deficit has to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is your own body. You are being eaten from the inside out, and the rate of consumption is directly tied to how hard you work. Work harder, burn more calories, get more food, but never enough food to replace what you burned. Work less, conserve energy, but receive even less food, accelerating the starvation. There is no winning position. There is only a choice between dying quickly or dying slowly, and the state has calculated both timelines with bureaucratic precision. The average life expectancy of a prisoner in the Kolyma gold fields was approximately 2 years. Many did not last one winter. The system was not designed to rehabilitate you or even to punish you. It was designed to extract the maximum amount of labor from your body before that body ceased to function, at which point you would be replaced by the next train of prisoners arriving from the mainland. You are not a worker. You are fuel. And the most remarkable part? Someone wrote all of this down in official planning documents. Someone calculated exactly how long a human being could survive on these rations while performing this labor, and they set the quotas accordingly. Welcome to the worker's paradise. Try to stay warm. The day begins in darkness, because this is Kolyma in winter, and the sun will not rise for hours yet, and when it does, it will barely clear the horizon before giving up and sliding back down. You wake at 5 in the morning to the sound of a guard hammering on the barracks door and shouting words that you have stopped hearing as language and now experience only as the sound of another day beginning. Your first conscious breath hurts. The air inside the barracks is cold enough that your exhale immediately becomes visible, a small cloud that joins the fog of respiration from 200 other bodies packed into a space designed for perhaps 50. Your second conscious thought is about the man in the bunk beside you, who has not moved. he is not asleep. You can tell by the stillness, which is different from the stillness of rest. His face has a particular waxen quality in the dim light filtering through the frost-covered windows. But you do not report this, and neither does anyone else. The dead do not eat, which means his ration can be collected by someone who needs it. He will be counted at the evening roll call, discovered missing, and only then will his body be removed. Until that moment, he is simply a quiet neighbor. You sit up and feel your spine protest. The wooden bunks are stacked 3 high, thin planks covered with a mattress of wood shavings that compacted into uselessness within your first week here. Your single blanket is inadequate for the temperature, which is why you and your bunkmates sleep pressed together like sardines in a frozen tin. Body heat is a communal resource here, and privacy is a luxury that died on the transport ship. You have been wearing the same quilted jacket and cotton trousers for 6 weeks. They were already threadbare when you received them from a prisoner who no longer needed clothes. They smell of sweat and fear and the particular musk of bodies that have not been properly cleaned in months. Beneath them, your skin is a landscape of rashes and sores and the small red dots of lice bites that you have stopped noticing. Your felt boots wait by your bunk, and you shove your feet into them with the urgency of someone who knows that every minute of warmth matters. Your fingers are already aching, and you have not even stepped outside yet. Today you will spend 12 hours swinging a pickaxe into frozen gold-bearing gravel. Today you will try to meet a quota that mathematics says is impossible. Today, you will try not to become the quiet neighbor who does not move when the guards hammer on the door. But first, breakfast. If you can call it that. Breakfast is a ritual of disappointment that takes approximately 4 minutes. You shuffle through the mess hall line and receive your ration based on yesterday's quota percentage. A piece of black bread that weighs somewhere between precious and insulting, and a bowl of thin gruel that tastes primarily of hot water and secondarily of the idea of grain. You eat standing up because sitting down takes energy you cannot spare, and you eat fast because the column will form with or without you. Outside, the cold is a physical presence. It does not simply surround you. It enters you. Your first breath outside the barracks feels like inhaling broken glass. Your nostrils freeze together. The moisture in your eyes begins to crystallize at the edges. The temperature today is minus 47 degrees, which is not even particularly cold for Kolyma in winter. Next month it will drop to minus 60, and the month after that somehow worse. The march to the mine takes 45 minutes. You walk in a column of prisoners, 5 abreast, surrounded by guards with rifles and dogs that have been trained to track escapees through the snow. Not that escape is a realistic concern. The nearest settlement outside the camp system is hundreds of kilometers away through trackless frozen wilderness. The few who have tried to run were found weeks later by search parties, frozen in positions that suggested they had simply sat down to rest and never gotten up again. The cold kills faster than any guard could. The landscape around you is aggressively hostile. This is permafrost country, where the ground has been frozen solid for thousands of years and will remain frozen long after you and everyone you know are gone. No trees grow here. The only vegetation is scrub brush and lichen, and even that is buried under snow for 8 months of the year. The horizon is flat and white and endless, and the sky is a shade of gray that seems personally offended by the concept of hope. You march in your felt boots, which are called valenki, and which are the only thing between your feet and amputation. Even so, your toes have gone numb within the first 10 minutes. You will spend the rest of the march periodically wiggling them to confirm they still exist. The prisoner beside you stumbles, and you catch his arm without thinking, helping him regain his footing. This is not kindness exactly. This is survival calculus. If he falls and cannot get up, the guards will leave him, and tonight his bunk will be empty, and the cold will have one more victory to its name. Ahead through the pre-dawn gloom, you can see the glow of the worksite. Fires burning in pits to thaw the permafrost. Floodlights powered by generators that prisoners also maintain. The gold mine waits for you like a mouth in the earth, and you march toward it, because the alternative is to stop moving, and stopping moving in Kolyma is just death with extra steps. Or rather, with no steps at all. The mine opens before you like a wound in the world. It is an open pit excavation carved into the permafrost entirely by hand tools and dying men, and it stretches across the landscape in terrace shelves that descend toward a center point you cannot see from the rim. Standing at the edge, looking down, you understand for the first time the scale of what human desperation can accomplish when it has no choice. Thousands of prisoners have worked this pit. Tens of thousands. The gold-bearing gravel lies deep beneath the surface, frozen solid for millennia, and reaching it requires first removing everything on top of it. This removal has been accomplished one shovelful at a time, one wheelbarrow at a time, one body at a time. The walls of the pit are layered like geological strata, except instead of marking ages of the earth, they mark seasons of extraction. You can see the cut lines where different brigades work different sections, their progress measured in meters of depth and kilograms of flesh. Your brigade leader hands you your tools for the day. A pickaxe with a wooden handle that has been worn smooth by countless hands before yours. A shovel with a metal blade that will freeze to your skin if you touch it without gloves. A wheelbarrow with a wheel that squeaks with each rotation like a small animal in distress. These are what you will use to tear gold from the earth. There are no machines here, no modern equipment, nothing that might make the work easier or more efficient. Machines cost money. Prisoners are free. But there is a problem. The ground is frozen so hard that your pickaxe bounces off it like you are striking concrete. Before any digging can happen, the permafrost must be thawed, which is accomplished through the application of fire. Along the work face, bonfires burn in shallow pits, their heat slowly softening the top few inches of earth. Prisoners tend these fires through the night, feeding them with whatever fuel can be found, and by morning, the ground is theoretically soft enough to be worked. Theoretically. You approach the quota board mounted at the edge of your work section. Today's norma is listed in neat Cyrillic characters. Each prisoner in your brigade must extract and process 8 cubic meters of gold-bearing gravel. 8 cubic meters is approximately 16,000 pounds of frozen earth that must be broken, loaded, hauled, and dumped into the processing sluices. Your brigade has 12 men. Together you must move nearly 200,000 pounds of material before the shift ends. If you succeed, you eat. If you fail, you eat less, which means tomorrow you will be weaker, which means tomorrow you will fail worse. Somewhere in Moscow, an official is reading reports about gold production quotas. Somewhere in the West, a banker is assessing Soviet gold reserves for international trade purposes. Somewhere in a museum that does not yet exist, Someone will one day display charts showing the growth of Soviet industrial output. None of them will see you standing here at the edge of this pit, holding tools that feel too heavy already, doing arithmetic in your head that always ends in the same answer. Time to dig. The first swing of the pickaxe tells you everything about how this day will go. The impact travels up the wooden handle, through your wrists, into your shoulders, and rattles something loose in your chest. The frozen earth chips away in fragments smaller than your fist. 7 hours and 59 minutes remain. You settle into a rhythm because rhythm is the only way to survive this. Swing, impact, chip. Your breath comes in clouds that freeze on your beard and eyebrows, creating a mask of ice that you periodically crack away with numb fingers. Your arms begin to burn within the first hour, a deep muscular fire that will become a permanent companion. By the second hour, you stop noticing the burning because you have moved past sensation into a state of pure mechanical motion. Around you, your brigade works the same section of face. 12 men with pickaxes and shovels attacking the earth in a coordinated assault that would be impressive if it were not so desperately sad. The man next to you was a professor of mathematics in Leningrad before his arrest. The man beyond him was a factory manager from Kiev. The man beyond that was a peasant farmer who made the mistake of owning 2 cows instead of 1, which made him a kulak, which made him an enemy of the people. None of their previous skills matter here. What matters is whether they can swing a pickaxe for 12 hours in temperatures that want them dead. Your shovel handle freezes to your gloves when you pause to load the wheelbarrow. This is not a metaphor. The metal conducts cold so efficiently that the moisture in your cheap cotton gloves crystallizes on contact, bonding fabric to metal. You tear your hand away and leave a layer of skin behind, a sacrifice to the god of gold extraction. Tomorrow the wound will be worse because tonight you will not have the calories to heal properly. The wheelbarrow weighs approximately 50 pounds empty. Loaded with gold-bearing gravel, it weighs closer to 400. You push it up a ramp of packed ice toward the processing sluices, your legs driving against the ground, your back screaming with effort, your lungs burning from the cold air you are forcing into them faster than they want to accept it. At the top, you dump the load and watch it tumble into the sluice system where water and gravity will separate gold from gravel. Then you turn around and push the empty wheelbarrow back down to the work face to do it again. Hour 3. Hour 4. Somewhere around hour 5, you stop counting. Time becomes elastic, stretching and compressing according to laws that have nothing to do with clocks. A moment of rest feels like seconds. A difficult load feels like years. You exist in a present tense that has no beginning and no end, only the swing of the pickaxe and the weight of the wheelbarrow and the cold that never stops. Your body is burning calories it does not have. You can feel yourself being consumed from within, fat reserves that disappeared months ago giving way to muscle tissue that you need for tomorrow's shift. Every swing of the pickaxe costs you something you cannot replace. Every step up the ramp to the sluice is paid for with a portion of your future. You are spending yourself, and the balance is getting very low. Somewhere around hour 10, the mathematics professor from Leningrad sits down in the snow and does not get up. A guard walks over, kicks him experimentally, and shouts something. The professor does not respond. 2 other prisoners are detailed to drag him to the edge of the pit where he will wait for the medical team that may or may not come before he freezes completely. His quota percentage for today will be 0. His ration tonight will be the punishment minimum. If he survives until morning, he will be even weaker, and the cycle will continue until it completes. 2 hours remain. You keep swinging. There is a social order in hell, and you need to understand it if you want to last longer than the mathematics professor. The Gulag is not a unified mass of suffering. It is a carefully structured hierarchy of suffering, and your position in that hierarchy determines whether you die this month or next year. At the top are the Urki. These are the professional criminals, the thieves, and murderers who were imprisoned for actual crimes rather than political unreliability. In the inverted logic of the Soviet system, they are considered socially friendly elements who can be rehabilitated, unlike you, a political prisoner who is fundamentally ideologically contaminated. The Urki do not work in the mines. They hold positions as trustees, as barrack supervisors, as brigade leaders. They control the internal economy of the camp, trading in food, clothing, and favors. They take what they want from other prisoners, and the guards do not intervene because the guards need the Urki to maintain order. Below the Urki are the common criminals of lesser status, then the trustees who have earned their positions through collaboration, then the brigade leaders who are technically prisoners but hold power over other prisoners. These are the men who assign you to work sections, who report your quota percentage, who can make the difference between a survivable shift and an impossible one. Pleasing them is essential. Displeasing them is fatal. Below all of them are the political prisoners, the intellectuals, the former party members who fell out of favor, the peasants who resisted collectivization, the engineers accused of sabotage, the students who told the wrong joke within earshot of an informer. This is your category. You are the lowest class of prisoner, the least protected, the most expendable. The system considers you beyond redemption, which means the system has no investment in your survival. And within the political prisoners, there is one more distinction. There are those who still believe they will survive, and those who have stopped believing. The believers wake up each morning with some reserve of hope that allows them to face the day. The non-believers have entered a state called dakodyaga, which translates roughly to goner. You can identify a dakodyaga by the way they move, shuffling rather than walking, and by the way their eyes have stopped focusing on anything beyond the immediate present. They are already dead. Their bodies simply have not accepted the information yet. Your brigade operates on collective punishment. If the brigade as a whole fails to meet its quota, everyone receives reduced rations, regardless of individual performance. This turns every weak member of your group into a liability. That mathematical professor who collapsed today has cost all of you calories. Tomorrow, when you are weaker because of his failure, you will be less able to cover for the next person who falls. The system turns prisoners against each other by making survival competitive, and it does this intentionally, because prisoners who are fighting among themselves are not fighting against the guard. You learn to watch your brigade members with calculating eyes. You learn to assess who is getting stronger and who is getting weaker. You learn to position yourself near the strong ones during work shifts and avoid the weak ones at meal distribution. You hate that you have learned these things. You do them anyway. Survival is a collaborative betrayal. The shift ends not with a bell or a whistle, but with a gradual dimming of activity as the sun drops below the horizon and the floodlights become the only illumination in the pit. Guards begin shouting for prisoners to form up. You drop your tools where you stand, not because you are allowed to, but because you physically cannot carry them any farther. The wheelbarrow remains at the base of the ramp, half loaded, a monument to the exact moment your body refused to continue. The march back to camp takes the same 45 minutes as the march out, but it feels longer because you are now running on empty in a way that the morning version of you could not have comprehended. Your legs move through memory rather than intention. Your arms swing at your sides like dead things attached to your shoulders by accident. Around you, 200 other prisoners perform the same shuffling automation, a column of exhausted ghosts following the guards back to the barracks. But the day is not over. The day is never over until the numbers are calculated and the rations are distributed, because in the Gulag, dinner is not a meal. Dinner is a verdict. You enter the mess hall and join the line. At the front, a clerk consults a ledger showing each prisoner's quota percentage for the day. Your brigade managed 73% of its collective target, which was actually better than most days, but still 27% short of full rations. The clerk performs a calculation, consults a chart, and hands you a piece of black bread that weighs perhaps 400 grams. This will be your primary source of calories for the next 20 hours. The bread is not good. This is an understatement of criminal proportions. The bread is made from flour mixed with sawdust and sometimes worse things, baked into loaves that have the texture of compressed cardboard and the flavor of institutional despair. But you hold it in your hands like it is precious, because it is precious, because it is the difference between surviving another day and not surviving another day. You find a seat at the long wooden tables and receive your soup. It is called balanda, and it is the culinary equivalent of a broken promise. The base is hot water. Floating in the hot water are pieces of fish head, which is to say bones and cartilage, and occasionally an eye that stares up at you with what feels like accusation. There may also be some cabbage, though the cabbage has been cooked so long that it has achieved a philosophical state between solid and liquid. You drink the balanda in long gulps because it is warm and warmth is survival, and you cannot afford to be particular about sources of warmth. Around you, prisoners negotiate. A man trades half of tonight's bread for all of tomorrow's soup, gambling that tomorrow he will feel stronger and need the liquid less. Another man pays a debt to one of the Urki with a portion of his ration, protection money extracted in calories. A third man eats with his hands cupped around his food, his body curved over the table, shielding his meal from anyone who might try to take it. There is no dignity here. Dignity requires a surplus of resources, and there is no surplus. You eat your bread slowly, not because you want to savor it, but because eating slowly tricks your stomach into feeling fuller for longer. This is a technique you learned from a prisoner who died 3 weeks ago. You think about him sometimes. You think about the things he taught you. You wonder who will learn things from you after you are gone. The meal takes 12 minutes. Then the mess hall begins to empty, and the night begins. The barracks is not quiet. The barracks is never quiet. What fills the space is a soundscape of human suffering that plays continuously from lights out until the morning hammer on the door, a symphony composed for instruments no one would willingly play. There is coughing. Tuberculosis moves through the Gulag like a rumor, spreading from lungs to lungs in the close quarters of the sleeping barracks, and you can track its progress by the particular wet, rattling quality of the coughs you hear in the dark. There is weeping, though it is usually muffled, because weeping too loudly attracts attention from the Urki, who consider emotional display a sign of weakness worth exploiting. There is moaning from men whose bodies have accumulated too much damage to process silently. There is the occasional scream from nightmares that cannot be suppressed. And beneath all of that, there is the simple biological noise of 200 bodies packed into a space that can barely contain them. Breathing, shifting, the rustle of thin blankets, the creak of wooden bunks, the particular wet sounds of bodily functions that cannot be delayed until morning. You lie in your bunk, pressed between the man on your left and the man on your right, sharing heat out of necessity, and you try to find a position that does not aggravate the sores on your back, or the blisters on your hands, or the frostbite on your feet. Sleep comes, but it is not restful sleep. It is the unconsciousness of exhaustion, a shutdown rather than a rest cycle, and it is interrupted constantly by cold, by pain, by the movements of your bunk neighbors, by the coughing and weeping and moaning that never stops. You dream of food. Everyone dreams of food. Your subconscious has been colonized by calories, and it stages elaborate fantasies of meals you ate years ago, before your arrest, before the transport, before the pit. You wake from these dreams hungrier than when you fell asleep. In the darkness, you do what you can to preserve your mind. This is a technique that survivors describe in their memoirs, a deliberate practice of mental exercise designed to keep some portion of yourself alive and functioning. You recite poetry you memorized in school. You work through mathematical problems in your head. You reconstruct, brick by brick, the apartment you lived in before your arrest, placing each piece of furniture, each photograph on the wall, each book on the shelf. You hold conversations with people who are not here, who may not even be alive anymore, speaking to them silently in the theater of your skull. The night stretch. In Kolyma in winter, there are perhaps 4 hours of gray twilight that pass for daylight, which means 20 hours of darkness, which means the nights feel endless even when you are only awake for portions of them. Time distorts. Was that an hour of sleep or 4 hours? Was that yesterday or 3 days ago? The sameness of the days makes memory unreliable, and you begin to lose track of how long you have been here. The calendar becomes meaningless. The only measure of time that matters is whether you wake up in the morning or whether you do not. Tomorrow will be exactly like today. Today was exactly like yesterday. The repetition is its own form of torture, a grinding away of hope through sheer monotony. And yet you endure it, because the alternative is to stop enduring, and stopping enduring means becoming the quiet neighbor who does not move when the guards hammer on the door. The barracks is not quiet. But eventually, despite everything, you sleep. You know you're becoming a Dakhodyaga before anyone else does. The knowledge arrives not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow accumulation of evidence that your body is failing faster than your will can compensate. It starts with the cold. Not the external cold, which has been a constant since you arrived, but an internal cold that settles into your bones and refuses to leave regardless of how many bodies you press against at night. Your core temperature is dropping because you no longer have enough body fat to insulate yourself. And without insulation, the heat your metabolism produces radiates away into the frozen air faster than it can be replaced. You are a furnace running out of fuel, and the fire is dying. Then come the symptoms that you recognize from watching others. Your gums begin to bleed. This is scurvy, a disease you associated with sailors in history books, now making itself at home in your mouth because you have not had fresh vegetables in months. Your skin develops sores that refuse to heal, open wounds that simply persist because your body lacks the resources to repair itself. Your hair begins to fall out in clumps. Your fingernails develop horizontal ridges, each ridge marking a period of severe nutritional deprivation like rings in a tree trunk. The diseases of the Gulag move through you like tourists visiting sites of interest. Pellagra, from vitamin deficiency, which causes skin lesions and confusion. Dysentery, from contaminated food and water, which strips whatever nutrition you manage to consume directly out of your system before it can be absorbed. Frostbite, which claims the tips of your fingers and the edges of your ears, turning flesh black and then making it fall away. You inventory your losses like a shopkeeper counting stock after a robbery. The worst part is the math. You can feel yourself failing to meet quota, and you can feel the ration reductions that follow, and you can feel the accelerating spiral that results. Yesterday, you managed 68%. Today, you will manage less because yesterday's reduced rations left you weaker. Tomorrow will be worse because today's will be smaller still. The system is a ratchet that only turns in one direction, and each click moves you closer to the category of prisoner who does not survive. Some prisoners attempt self-mutilation as a desperate escape from the spiral. A man in your brigade deliberately smashed his own hand with a rock last week, shattering the bones, rendering himself unable to work. The guards took him to the medical barracks, where he now receives the sick ration, which is smaller than the work ration, but requires no expenditure of labor. He has traded the certainty of death from exhaustion for the possibility of death from starvation, a calculation that makes sense only when both options are ultimately fatal. You have thought about doing the same thing. You have not done it yet. The medical barracks exists, but it offers little that could be called medicine. There are doctors who are prisoners themselves, working with whatever supplies the state deigns to provide, which is to say almost nothing. They can diagnose your condition with precision. They cannot treat it. The treatment for scurvy is fresh fruit. The treatment for pellagra is balanced nutrition. The treatment for starvation is food. None of these things are available. What the medical barracks offers is a temporary reprieve from work, a chance to let your body stabilize before returning to the pit, assuming you have not crossed the threshold where stabilization is no longer possible. You are approaching that threshold. You can feel it the way you might feel the edge of a cliff in the dark, sensing the void ahead without being able to see it. Every morning when you wake, you are surprised that you have woken. Every evening when you return from the pit, you are surprised that you returned. You are surviving on borrowed time, and the lender is getting impatient. The mortality statistics for Kolyma are inexact because the state did not keep precise records, or did keep them and destroyed them, or kept them and classified them. Estimates suggest that between 200,000 and 1 million prisoners died in the Kolyma gold fields over 20 years of operation. The truth is probably somewhere in that range, which is a very large range, which tells you something about how carefully the dead were counted. You may become a statistic. You may become a body left at the edge of the pit, waiting for the ground to thaw enough for burial. You may become a name that no one speaks because no one is left who remembers it. But not today. Today you are still here. Today you will swing the pickaxe and push the wheelbarrow and eat the belanda with the fish eyes staring up. Today is not the day you die. Let us pause for a moment and talk about where the gold goes. Because you have been digging it out of the frozen earth with your bare hands and your dying body, and you deserve to know what your sacrifice is funding. The gold leaves Kolyma on ships that sail from the port of Magadan, loaded into crates that are guarded with far more care than any prisoner has ever received. It travels across the Pacific to Soviet trading partners, or it enters the international gold market through intermediaries, or it sits in vaults beneath the state bank in Moscow, backing the Soviet ruble with the promise of precious metal. The gold you dig funds the 5-year plans. It purchases industrial equipment from the West. It finances the construction of factories and dams and apartment blocks that will be photographed for propaganda purposes and presented to the world as evidence of socialist triumph. Here is the irony that might make you scream if you had the energy for screaming. The Soviet Union, during the years you were being worked to death in Kolyma, is presenting itself internationally as a worker's paradise. The propaganda posters show happy laborers in clean factories, smiling as they exceed their production targets. The newsreels show collective farms bursting with grain, children playing in new schools, women entering professions previously closed to them. The message, repeated endlessly through every available channel, is that socialism has solved the problems of capitalism. No exploitation. No poverty. No human beings treated as disposable fuel for industrial production. And all of it, every poster and newsreel and diplomatic boast, is paid for with the gold you are digging from frozen ground with a pickaxe you can barely lift. The total gold production of Kolyma between 1932 and 1954 was approximately 1,100 metric tons. At current prices, that would be worth roughly $60 billion, though the value at the time was calculated differently. What cannot be calculated, or rather what was calculated and deliberately ignored, was the cost in human lives. 1 million prisoners passed through the Kolyma system. Somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 of them died there. If we split the difference and say 300,000 deaths, then the exchange rate works out to approximately 3 kilograms of gold per human life, which is about the weight of a small brick, which is about the value the Soviet state placed on your existence. The gold funded the industrialization that allowed the Soviet Union to fight World War II. It funded the post-war reconstruction that allowed the USSR to become a superpower. It funded the nuclear weapons program and the space program and all the gleaming achievements that history books record as evidence of Soviet modernity. Somewhere in every rocket that reached orbit and every bomb that was tested in the desert, there is a trace of Kolyma gold. Somewhere in every photograph of Yuri Gagarin's smile, there is a shadow of the pit you are standing in right now. And here is the final cruelty. After Stalin's death, after the Gulag system was officially acknowledged and condemned, after the survivors were released and the camps were closed, the gold remained. It did not disappear. It did not return to the earth from which it was taken. It stayed in circulation, backing currencies and funding economies and passing from hand to hand in transactions that grew further and further from the frozen ground where it originated. The gold is still out there, shaped into jewelry and dental fillings and electronic components, carrying no mark of its origin, telling no story of its cost. You are digging a grave and filling it with your own future. But the gold does not care. The gold never cared. The gold was just waiting in the ground for someone desperate enough to retrieve it. So, could you survive? The honest answer is almost certainly no. The mathematics of the Gulag were designed to produce exactly one outcome, and survival was not it. The average prisoner lasted 2 years in Kolyma. The exceptional ones, through some combination of luck and physical resilience and psychological fortitude and the intervention of circumstances beyond their control, lasted longer. But lasting longer was not the same as surviving. Many of those who lived through the camps emerged as broken people, their bodies permanently damaged, their minds scarred by traumas that would echo through the rest of their lives. They survived in the technical sense that their hearts continued beating. Whether they survived in any meaningful sense is a more complicated question. The prisoners who documented their experiences, the ones who gave us the testimony that allows us to understand what happened in places like Kolyma, were the exceptions that prove the rule. Varlam Shelemov spent 17 years in the camps, and afterward wrote a series of stories called Kolyma Tales that are considered among the most important literature of the 20th century. He survived through a combination of his training as a medical assistant, which gave him access to less lethal work assignments, and sheer improbable fortune that he himself could not explain. He did not believe survival was a matter of moral strength or will. He believed it was random, a cosmic dice roll that most people lost. The permafrost is still giving up bodies. As climate change warms the Arctic, as the ground that has been frozen for millennia begins to thaw, human remains emerge from the soil of Kolyma and other Gulag sites. Bones. Sometimes entire corpses, preserved by the cold, still wearing the same inadequate clothing they died in. Archaeologists and activists document these discoveries, adding names to the memorial when names can be determined, adding numbers to the toll when they cannot. The earth is testifying, slowly, about what was done to the people who were sent there. And here is the part where I am supposed to draw a lesson to connect the horrors of the Soviet Gulag to something recognizable in your own life, to make the story relevant in a way that justifies the time you have spent listening to it. I could talk about modern supply chains and the invisible suffering embedded in cheap consumer goods. I could talk about mass incarceration and the ways that prison labor continues to extract value from human bodies. I could talk about climate change and how the systems we depend on are built on costs that someone else pays. All of these connections are real and worth making. But I think the more important thing to say is simpler. Remember them. Remember the mathematical professor from Leningrad who collapsed in the pit and may or may not have lived through the night. Remember the man who froze in his bunk and whose death was not reported until evening count because dead men do not eat rations. Remember the hundreds of thousands whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never told, who simply vanished into the permafrost and are only now, decades later, beginning to emerge. Remember that someone calculated exactly how long a human being could survive on starvation rations while performing forced labor in fatal temperatures, and someone else approved those calculations, and someone else implemented them, and the system ran for 22 years before it was officially acknowledged as an atrocity. Remember that the gold is still in circulation. Remember that the propaganda posters still exist in museums, cheerful workers in warm factories, and that those posters were paid for with frozen corpses. You are sitting somewhere warm right now, I hope. You have access to food, I hope. Your body is not being consumed as fuel for industrial production, I hope. These are not small things. These are the things that the prisoners of Kolyma dreamed about in their bunks, in their brief and interrupted sleep, in the darkness that lasted 20 hours a day. Think about them sometimes. when you see gold, when you hear about economic miracles built on cheap labor, when someone tells you that progress has costs and those costs are acceptable. Think about the pit carved into the permafrost by dying hands. Think about the arithmetic of starvation. Think about the quiet neighbors who did not wake up when the guards hammered on the door. They deserve to be remembered. That is the least we can give them. That is the most we can give them. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is something. And something in a system designed to reduce human beings to nothing is a victory of sorts. There is a story we love to tell about the Library of Alexandria. It involves flames, tragedy, and usually Julius Caesar looking regretful while the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world transforms into ash and smoke. It is dramatic. It is cinematic. And it is, unfortunately, mostly wrong. The fire that Caesar's forces started in 48 BCE did burn something. That much is true. But what burned were warehouses near the harbor, likely filled with books awaiting export, not the main library complex itself. The great institution, with its towering shelves and its generations of collected scrolls, survived the flames just fine. It kept operating. Scholars kept arriving. Debates kept echoing through reading rooms. For centuries. This is the part that doesn't make it into the paintings. The Library of Alexandria didn't die in one spectacular evening of cultural arson. It died the way most institutions die, slowly, quietly, one disappointing budget meeting at a time. There was no villain twirling a torch. There was only a long succession of people deciding that other things mattered more. The uncomfortable truth is that institutional death is boring. It doesn't make for good cinema. No one wants to watch a 3-hour epic about deferred roof maintenance and unfilled staff positions. But that is what actually happened. The greatest repository of human knowledge in the ancient world didn't burn. It starved. It rotted. It was forgotten into oblivion by people who always meant to get around to funding it properly next year. So let us set aside the dramatic fire. Let us dim the theatrical lighting and ask a far more unsettling question. How does something this important, this irreplaceable, simply fade away? And more importantly, would we even notice if it happened again? Picture, for a moment, what it meant to keep the Library of Alexandria alive. Not metaphorically alive. Actually physically, materially functioning. Because a library in the ancient world was not a building where books sat quietly on shelves, waiting to be read. It was a constant war against time, humidity, and the determined appetites of insects. Papyrus, the material that held nearly everything the library owned, had a lifespan of roughly 100 to 200 years under good conditions. Alexandria did not have good conditions. The city sat in the Nile Delta, where Mediterranean humidity crept into everything. Papyrus absorbed moisture like a sponge, then slowly decomposed from the inside. The smell of aging papyrus in a neglected storage room was distinctive, a kind of sweet mustiness, like dried flowers left too long in a vase, slowly becoming something else entirely. This meant that preservation was not passive. Every scroll in that library needed to be copied by hand every century or so just to avoid disappearing. and the library held, by most estimates, somewhere between 40,000 and 400,000 scrolls. The math is staggering. Even at the low end, that required an army of scribes working constantly, year after year, generation after generation, just to stay even. And then there were the mice, and the bookworms, and the silverfish that loved nothing more than to tunnel through papyrus fibers in the dark corners of storage rooms that no one checked very often. The scratch of tiny teeth on ancient scrolls was a sound that echoed through every library in the ancient world, a soft background noise of knowledge being consumed, one fiber at a time. Running the Library of Alexandria was not about acquiring great works. It was about copying, preserving, repairing, and replacing the works that were already there before they crumbled into dust. The library was not a monument. It was a living organism, and like all living things, it needed constant feeding. The question was never whether Alexandria could collect the wisdom of the world. The question was whether anyone would keep paying the people who stopped it from rotting. For the first 2 centuries of its existence, the Library of Alexandria had a patron with unlimited resources and unlimited ego. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, treated the library as a personal glory project. They funded it lavishly because it made them look sophisticated, cultured, worthy of ruling one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the Mediterranean. Acquisition agents traveled the ancient world buying, borrowing, and occasionally stealing scrolls. Ships arriving in Alexandria were searched, and any books found were confiscated, copied, with the copies returned to the owners and the originals kept for the collection. The Ptolemies did not care about the cost. They cared about the prestige of owning every piece of written knowledge in existence. This is how institutions thrive. Not through necessity, but through someone's burning desire to show off. Then Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, and everything changed. Not immediately. Not dramatically. The library did not burn or close. It simply stopped being anyone's priority. Roman administrators viewed Egypt primarily as a grain basket, a source of wealth to be extracted and shipped elsewhere. The library was a nice amenity, certainly. A cultural landmark worth mentioning in letters home. But it was not something Rome needed to fund generously. There were aqueducts to build, legions to pay, circuses to keep the populace entertained. The acquisition budget shrank. Not to zero, but enough that the agents stopped traveling as far, stopped competing as aggressively at manuscript auctions. The copying staff was reduced, not eliminated, just trimmed around the edges in ways that seemed reasonable at the time. Fewer new hires to replace scribes who died or retired. Salaries that didn't quite keep pace with inflation. No one made a decision to kill the library. They simply made 1,000 small decisions to fund other things first. The phrase that echoed through centuries of administrative meetings was always the same. We will address that properly next year. Next year, somehow, never arrived. For a long time, Alexandria was the place to be. Scholars traveled from across the Mediterranean to study there, to debate in its halls, to access scrolls found nowhere else. The city's position at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe made it a natural gathering point for ideas, trade, and ambitious intellectuals looking to make their names. But geography is not permanent. Political centers shift. Trade routes move. And prestige, that most ephemeral of currencies, flows toward power. Rome became the new magnet. The empire's capital offered better funding, closer proximity to political influence, and an audience that actually mattered for career advancement. A scholar who impressed a Roman senator could secure patronage for life. A scholar who impressed a librarian in Alexandria could secure access to scrolls that were slowly falling apart. The brain drain started gradually. First the most ambitious scholars, then the merely competent ones seeking better salaries. The library still had its collections, still had its reputation, but the living intellectual culture that gave those collections meaning was quietly relocating. Then Constantinople rose, and the center of gravity shifted again. The new Christian capital of the Eastern Empire invested heavily in its own institutions, building libraries, funding scholars, creating a new intellectual ecosystem that didn't need Alexandria at all. The old library became a relic, a place historians mentioned with reverence while actual scholars went elsewhere. The reading rooms grew quieter. Debates that once drew crowds became conversations between a handful of aging academics who remembered better days. The silence was not sudden. It crept in over generations, filling spaces where voices used to echo. Scholars vote with their feet. They always have. And when the feet stopped walking toward Alexandria, the library's death became a matter of when, not if. An institution without people is just a building full of objects. And objects, left alone long enough, have a tendency to disappear. Here is something no one wants to talk about when discussing the death of great institutions. Roofs leak. Walls crack. Pipes, where they exist, corrode. And when no one fixes these problems for a decade, then 2 decades, then a century, the building that holds irreplaceable treasures slowly becomes the thing that destroys them. The Library of Alexandria was not a single building, but a complex of structures, some dating back centuries, all requiring constant attention. Plaster needed patching. Stone foundations needed shoring up. The drainage systems that kept Alexandria's delta humidity from pooling in storage rooms needed cleaning, repair, and occasional replacement. None of this was glamorous work. No patron wanted their name on a plaque commemorating fixed gutters. No administrator earned promotion by ensuring the roof didn't leak. And so the maintenance budgets were always the first to be trimmed, the requests always the first to be deferred. Water damage is patient. It does not announce itself dramatically. It seeps slowly through cracks no one noticed, pooling in corners no one checked. Scrolls stored against exterior walls absorbed moisture through the stone, their edges turning soft, their ink beginning to blur. By the time anyone noticed, the damage was done. And in the dark corners, in the storage rooms that held scrolls no one had requested in years, the mice made their homes. The scratch of tiny claws on papyrus became background noise, so constant that the remaining staff stopped hearing it. Entire collections were hollowed out from within, nesting material for generations of rodents who found the ancient wisdom of the Greeks quite comfortable to sleep in. Deferred maintenance is a form of slow-motion violence against the future. Every decision to fix the roof next year was a decision to let something irreplaceable decay a little more. the library did not collapse. It softened, sagged, and crumbled, one small failure at a time, while everyone waited for someone else to do something about it. Consider, for a moment, the librarians. Not the legendary scholars whose names survived in histories, but the ordinary workers who actually kept the institution running. The scribes who spent their days copying texts letter by letter. The catalogers who tracked which scroll was stored where. The preservation specialists who knew which collections needed recopying most urgently. These were skilled positions, requiring years of training and genuine expertise. In the library's golden age, they were well compensated, respected, sought after. Young scholars competed for junior positions, knowing that a career in the great library was a career worth having. Then the salary stopped keeping pace with the cost of living. Then the positions that opened up stopped being filled. Then the remaining staff found themselves doing the work of 3 people while being paid for half of one. The decline in morale was not dramatic. It was the quiet erosion of people who simply stopped trying as hard. The scribe who used to copy 3 scrolls a day now copied 2. Because why kill yourself for an institution that clearly didn't value the work? The cataloger who discovered misfiled collections stopped reporting them, because the reports just sat in piles that no one read. The truly talented left. They always do when institutions start dying. They found positions elsewhere, in Rome, in Constantinople, in private households that paid better and appreciated expertise. What remained were the people who couldn't leave, the ones too old to start over, too poor to travel, too attached to a place that no longer deserved their loyalty. These last librarians watched the collections they had devoted their lives to slowly fall apart. They knew which rooms were too damaged to enter, which sections had been consumed by insects, which scrolls would crumble if anyone actually tried to unroll them. They kept coming to work anyway, out of habit or obligation or the faint hope that someone would eventually notice. No one did. Knowledge died in those rooms not because evil forces destroyed it, but because nobody's job was to save it anymore. The position of someone who cared had been eliminated in budget cuts decades ago. There is a form of death worse than destruction. It is the death of being forgotten, of becoming irrelevant while still technically existing. The Library of Alexandria experienced this death long before its physical end. For centuries, the library had been a living institution. New works arrived constantly. Scholars debated current ideas using the ancient sources as foundation. The collection grew, evolved, remained connected to the intellectual life of its time. Then the acquisition slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. The library held what it held, and nothing more. New scholarship was being created in Rome, in Athens, in Constantinople, in 100 other places that had no connection to Alexandria's aging shelves. The great debates of the 3rd and 4th centuries happened elsewhere, referencing sources that Alexandria didn't own. The collection became a museum of yesterday's knowledge. Valuable, certainly. Historically significant, absolutely. But no longer essential to anyone's active work. Scholars who visited came as tourists to see the famous institution, not to access materials they couldn't find elsewhere. The reading rooms were quieter now, not just because fewer people came, but because the people who came had nothing urgent to find. This is how collections become old books nobody reads. Not through neglect of important materials, but through the slow realization that the materials themselves have stopped being important. The intellectual world had moved on, and the library, frozen in time by lack of funding, couldn't follow. The scrolls still sat on their shelves, holding knowledge that someone somewhere had once considered essential. The mice still gnawed in the corners. The humidity still crept through the walls. But now there was something worse than physical decay. There was the growing sense that it didn't matter anymore. An institution can survive fire. It can survive conquest. But it cannot survive becoming irrelevant. Once the world decides it doesn't need what you have, you are already dead. The body just takes a while to notice. There is no villain in this story. That is the uncomfortable part. The Library of Alexandria died because 1,000 people made 1,000 small decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time. The administrator who trimmed the copying budget by 5% to fund something more urgent. The scholar who took a better position in Rome instead of staying. The donor who gave their money to a newer, flashier institution. The emperor who had more pressing concerns than maintaining a library in a province he'd never visited. No one decided to kill the greatest repository of human knowledge in the ancient world. They simply decided over and over again that other things mattered more. The Christian and Muslim conquests that are sometimes blamed for the library's destruction came at the end of a long dying. By the time new rulers arrived, there was not much left to destroy. The collections had rotted, been eaten, been sold off to pay debts, or simply been forgotten in rooms no one entered anymore. The dramatic destruction that legends love to describe was more like clearing away debris than burning a functioning institution. We tell ourselves it was fire because fire is simple. Fire has a clear beginning and end. Fire can be blamed on someone, condemned, mourned with appropriate theatrical grief. The truth is messier. The truth is that the library outlived its political usefulness, and once something stops being useful to the people with power, it begins its long slide into oblivion. Here is the part where we should feel uncomfortable, because this is not ancient history. This is current events. Across the modern world, libraries face shrinking budgets. Universities defer building maintenance for decades. Archives hold collections that no one has cataloged because the positions were eliminated. Museums store artifacts in conditions that preservation experts have been warning about for years, warnings that sit unread in inboxes. Scholars who know how to read ancient languages, who understand the methods of preservation, who carry the expertise built over generations, they watch as their positions disappear, as their departments are merged or eliminated, as the funding for their work evaporates. They leave for other careers. They retire without replacement. They die, and their knowledge dies with them. We are watching the Library of Alexandria happen again in slow motion all around us. The buildings are still standing. The books are still on shelves. But the quiet crisis of underfunding, understaffing, and deferred everything is hollowing out institutions that we assume will always be there. The library's ghost has a message for us, if we're willing to hear it. Great things do not die dramatically. They die because everyone assumes someone else will save them. We are all someone else. There is a story we tell ourselves about Rome. It goes something like this. The greatest empire in human history built magnificent aqueducts to carry fresh mountain water into its cities, lined those aqueducts with lead pipes because they didn't know any better, and slowly poisoned itself into collapse. The emperors went mad. The population declined. The barbarians walked in through gates defended by people too addled to fight back. It's a tidy narrative. Tragic, even. The mighty brought low by innocent ignorance. The aqueducts still stand, of course. Tourists photograph the Pont du Gard in southern France, marveling at engineering that moved water across valleys without pumps or electricity. The Aqua Claudia stretched for miles outside Rome, its arches marching across the countryside like stone soldiers frozen mid-parade. At the empire's height, Rome's water system delivered over 200 million gallons daily to a city of more than 1 million people. Fountains burbled on every corner. Public baths steamed with hot water piped directly from distant springs. The whole operation gleamed with the confidence of civilization at its apex. And yes, much of that water flowed through lead. The pipes had a particular look to them, a soft blue-white oxidation that formed on the surface over time. The Romans had a name for that coating. They called it cerussa, and they knew exactly what it was. They also knew what it did. Because here is the uncomfortable truth that the tidy narrative leaves out. Roman doctors wrote extensively about lead poisoning. Roman architects recommended alternatives. Roman senators banned lead-lined containers for wine. The empire's most widely circulated encyclopedia explicitly warned that lead caused madness and miscarriage. They knew. The documents survive. The warnings were clear. So why did they keep drinking from those pipes for 4 more centuries? The answer, as it turns out, has less to do with ignorance and rather more to do with money. But before we get to the economics, we should probably talk about the workers who built those beautiful, deadly systems in the first place. The ones whose hands turned blue. The men who worked with lead developed a particular look. Roman physicians learned to recognize it the way modern doctors recognize jaundice or anemia. There was a tremor in the hands that started small and grew worse over time. There was a distinctive blue line along the gums where the metal accumulated in soft tissue. And there was the wrist drop, the signature symptom that gave the condition its name, plumbum paralysis. Plumber's paralysis. The word plumber itself comes from the Latin plumbum, meaning lead. The men who installed Rome's water infrastructure were literally named after the substance that was slowly killing them. Medical texts from the period describe the progression with clinical precision. First came the abdominal cramps, the colic that workers called the painter's grip, because artists who mixed lead-based pigments suffered the same symptoms. Then the fatigue, a bone-deep exhaustion that rest couldn't cure. The tremors followed, subtle at first, then severe enough to interfere with the fine motor control the job demanded. Finally, in advanced cases, the paralysis that left hands dangling uselessly from wrists, unable to grip tools or cups or anything at all. Physicians documented treatment protocols. Rest. Removal from lead exposure. Specific dietary interventions. They understood causation well enough to prescribe prevention. The connection between handling the metal and developing the symptoms wasn't a mystery requiring modern toxicology to unravel. It was observed, named, treated, and recorded in texts that circulated throughout the empire. The blue-white oxidation on lead fixtures earned its own grim nickname in technical documents, death metal. Not because Romans had a flair for heavy metal album titles, but because they noticed the correlation between that distinctive coating and the suffering of the workers who touched it daily. Senate records mention the term in discussions of infrastructure maintenance. So there was a named disease, a documented cause, recognized symptoms, and established treatments. The empire possessed all the information necessary to understand that lead was dangerous. Which brings us to the architect who told them what to use instead. Marcus Vitruvius Pollio was not an obscure figure. His 10-volume work De Architectura, written around 25 BCE, became the standard engineering manual of the Roman world. Emperors consulted it. Builders memorized passages. When Renaissance architects rediscovered classical principles, Vitruvius was their primary source. The man shaped how buildings and infrastructure were designed for nearly 2,000 years. And in Book 8, Chapter 6, he explicitly recommended against lead pipes. His reasoning was straightforward. He had observed lead workers and noticed they looked unhealthy. Their complexions were pallid. Their bodies seemed damaged in ways that workers with other materials didn't experience. Vitruvius concluded that something in the lead was harmful and that water passing through lead pipes would carry that harm to everyone who drank it. He recommended clay pipes instead. Terracotta was abundant, cheap to manufacture, and produced water that tasted cleaner. He noted that the flavor of water from lead systems had a particular quality, a sweetness that clay didn't impart. That sweetness, he suggested, should be treated as a warning rather than a feature. The alternative existed. It was documented in the empire's most authoritative engineering text. Clay pipe manufacturing was a mature technology with established supply chains. The recommendation came from the single most respected architectural voice in the Roman world. Engineers built with lead anyway. The reason was economic, and it wasn't subtle. Lead was easier to work than clay, which cracked under pressure and required more careful installation. Bronze, the other durable alternative, cost approximately 10 times more than lead. When cities needed to extend their water systems to serve growing populations, when provincial governors faced infrastructure budgets and construction timelines, the math always came out the same way. Vitruvius's warning remained in the engineering manual. Builders read it, quoted it, and then did what the budget allowed. The empire's most widely circulated technical recommendation for avoiding lead poisoning sat right there on the page, next to the cost calculations that ensured it would be ignored. If Vitruvius reached engineers, Pliny the Elder reached everyone. His Naturalis Historia, completed in 77 CE, was the closest thing the ancient world had to an encyclopedia. 37 volumes covering everything from astronomy to agriculture, from medicine to metallurgy. The work was copied more frequently than almost any other text in the Roman world. Libraries stocked it. Scholars cited it. Educated Romans consulted it the way modern readers might check Wikipedia, as the default reference for questions about how the world worked. In Book 34, Pliny wrote about lead with the careful attention of someone documenting a known danger. He noted the sweetness that made lead attractive for certain applications, the pleasant taste it imparted to wine stored in lead-lined vessels. And then he noted what followed the sweetness, madness, miscarriage, and death. His language was not ambiguous. Lead, he wrote, caused the mind to deteriorate. It caused pregnant women to lose their children. Workers who handled it regularly developed the paralysis that his contemporary physicians had already documented. The substance was useful, yes. It was also poison. Pliny recommended avoiding lead in contexts where it would contact food or drink. He was aware of the Senate's ban on lead-lined wine containers. He understood that the same leaching that made wine sweet was happening in water pipes across the empire. He wrote all of this down in a book that became one of the most widely read works in human history. This was not obscure knowledge locked away in specialist texts that only a handful of scholars might encounter. This was mainstream information, available to anyone literate enough to access a library or wealthy enough to own a copy. The dangers of lead were documented in the empire's most popular reference work, sitting on shelves in every major city. And yet the pipes kept flowing. The fountains kept running. The sweet metallic taste kept coating tongues across the Roman world. Because knowing something is dangerous and doing something about it are, it turns out, entirely different activities. Roman wine had a particular problem that lead conveniently solved. The fermentation process was inconsistent, and storage was difficult in an era before glass bottles and cork stoppers became standard. Wine spoiled. It turned to vinegar. It developed off flavors that made it unsellable. Lead-lined amphorae fixed this. The metal leached into the wine, imparting a sweetness that masked spoilage and extended shelf life. Vintners discovered they could sell wine longer and charge more for the improved flavor. The practice became widespread among producers catering to wealthy Romans who could afford the premium. And then the Senate banned it. The records are not ambiguous. Roman lawmakers understood that lead leached into liquids stored in contact with it. They understood that consuming those liquids caused harm. They understood the mechanism well enough to pass legislation specifically prohibiting lead-lined containers for wine, one of the most economically important commodities in the empire. The ban protected something valuable. Wine was currency, commerce, culture. The wealthy drank it constantly. The vintage wines of Falernian and Cacuban estates commanded prices that would make modern collectors wince. When lead threatened that industry, when the connection between contaminated wine and sick consumers became too obvious to ignore, the Senate acted. Water was different. Water was free, or nearly so. The public fountains that served Rome's poorer districts were civic services, not profit centers. The people who drank from lead pipes were not the people who dined at senatorial banquets or purchased estate-bottled vintages. They were the masses, the workers, the population whose health was someone else's concern. The same body of lawmakers who banned lead from wine containers continued approving lead water infrastructure for public use. They possessed the knowledge to protect what mattered to them. They simply didn't extend that protection to everyone. This was not hypocrisy in the modern sense. It was priority. Wine was worth protecting. Water for the common people apparently was not. But surely the imperial household, with access to the best physicians in the world, would have protected itself better than the Senate protected its wine. Andromachus the Elder served as personal physician to the Emperor Nero. His position required him to be familiar with every ailment that might afflict the imperial household, from common fevers to assassination attempts. Among the conditions he documented and treated was lead poisoning. The treatment protocol was surprisingly specific. Iron supplements. The reasoning, though they lacked the biochemistry to explain it precisely, was sound by observation. Patients given iron seemed to recover better than those who weren't. Modern medicine would later confirm that iron competes with lead for absorption in the body, reducing the toxic metals accumulation. Andromachus got the treatment right without fully understanding why it worked. But here is what matters. There was a treatment. At the highest levels of Roman society, physicians recognized lead poisoning, diagnosed it in patients, and prescribed interventions to reverse its effects. The imperial household had access to this care. The emperor's own doctor knew how to address the condition. This was not folk medicine or superstition. This was sophisticated medical practice operating with accurate understanding of cause and effect. If someone in Nero's palace developed the tremors, the colic, the mental disturbances associated with lead exposure, there was a protocol to follow. They had options. The workers installing the pipes did not have access to imperial physicians. The families drinking from public fountains did not have prescriptions for iron supplements. The treatment existed in the same empire as the poisoning, but they occupied different worlds. Medical knowledge flowed to those who could pay for it or who served those who could. So the picture comes into focus. Engineers knew clay was safer. The encyclopedia warned of madness and miscarriage. The Senate banned lead from wine. The emperor's doctor prescribed treatment. At every level of Roman society, the information existed. The knowledge circulated. The warnings were written down and preserved. And the lead pipes kept running. The question was never whether they knew. The question was whether they cared enough to pay for something better. Let us talk about money, because that is ultimately what this story is about. Lead was cheap. The Romans had abundant lead deposits in Spain, Britain, and Sardinia. Mining operations extracted it as a byproduct of silver production, meaning the supply was essentially a bonus from an already profitable industry. The metal was soft, easy to shape, and simple to solder into pipes without specialized tools or training. A lead water system could be installed quickly and maintained cheaply. Clay required more careful handling. Terracotta pipes cracked under pressure, demanded better support structures, and couldn't be easily repaired when they failed. Installation took longer. Replacement parts were harder to standardize. Bronze was simply prohibitive. The copper and tin required for the alloy were expensive. The manufacturing process was more complex, and the finished pipes cost roughly 10 times what lead pipes cost for the same capacity. Building Rome's water infrastructure in bronze would have required a budget that no emperor or provincial governor was willing to authorize. So the calculation was straightforward. On one side of the ledger, affordable infrastructure that could serve a growing empire, fountains in every neighborhood, public baths as symbols of Roman civilization, water flowing to the expanding population. On the other side, some percentage of that population experiencing cognitive decline, miscarriages, tremors, and early death. The harm was distributed across millions of people over centuries. The savings were immediate and concentrated in the hands of those making the decisions. When the costs are diffuse and the benefits are specific, the specific benefits tend to win. This was not a conspiracy in the sense of secret meetings and whispered agreements. No cabal of senators gathered to decide that poisoning the populace was acceptable. It was something more mundane and more terrible, a series of individual decisions, each one rational in isolation, that accumulated into a system of mass harm that everyone could see and no one would stop. They knew the pipes were dangerous. They built them anyway. The math worked out, as long as you didn't count the bodies. In 2014, the city of Flint, Michigan switched its water source to save money. The new source was more corrosive than the old one. The pipes serving Flint's residents were made of lead. City officials knew this. State officials knew this. Federal guidelines existed for treating corrosive water to prevent lead leaching. Those guidelines were not followed. For over a year, residents complained that the water tasted strange, smelled wrong, looked discolored. Officials assured them it was safe. Internal documents later revealed that the people making those assurances had seen test results showing dangerous lead levels. They knew. They kept the water flowing anyway. In the 1920s, General Motors discovered that adding tetraethyl lead to gasoline improved engine performance. Their own researchers also discovered that lead exposure caused brain damage, particularly in children. GM funded studies. GM saw the results. GM sold leaded gasoline for the next 50 years, fighting regulations at every turn with the familiar refrain, more research needed. The pattern echoes across centuries. Document the harm in technical literature. Provide treatment or protection to those with resources. Maintain profitable systems for everyone else. Delay action with calls for additional study. Calculate that distributed suffering costs less than concentrated investment. Romans invented this playbook. They wrote medical texts describing lead poisoning, banned lead from wine containers, and prescribed treatments for the wealthy while maintaining lead water systems for the masses. The empire that built roads still used today also built the template for profitable negligence that corporations still follow. Some conspiracies require secret meetings, hidden documents, coordinated cover-ups. But the most effective conspiracies don't need any of that. They just require everyone to agree, implicitly, not to act on what they already know. They require the math to favor an action. They require the people making decisions to be different from the people suffering consequences. Rome didn't fall because they didn't know about lead. Rome shows us that knowing has never been the hard part. The hard part is deciding that some costs aren't acceptable, even when the accounting says they are. The aqueducts still stand. The documents still survive. And somewhere, right now, someone is running the same calculation the Romans ran, weighing infrastructure costs against distributed harm, concluding that some profits are worth a little madness. The pipes have changed. The math hasn't. The Sui dynasty did not fall gracefully. It collapsed like a fever patient finally giving in. thrashing and convulsing until the end came almost as a relief. By the time young Chen Yi turned 10 years old, the empire his grandfather had known was drowning in its own blood. The canals ran red. Not poetically, not metaphorically. Actually red because corpses had a way of accumulating in waterways when there were too many to bury and not enough people left alive to do the burying. The great public works projects that were supposed to glorify the Sui had instead consumed the peasantry like kindling, and now the peasantry was returning the favor by setting everything on fire. Chen Yi's father died when the boy was 10. The records don't specify how, which tells its own story. In times of famine and rebellion, death rarely needs a specific cause. It simply arrives, patient and thorough, and moves on to the next household. His mother followed soon after, her grief and starvation intertwining until they became indistinguishable. The boy had one thing left, an older brother who had already taken monastic vows. Not out of spiritual calling, though the official hagiographies would later suggest otherwise. Buddhist monasteries in early 7th century China served a function that had little to do with enlightenment. They had walls. They had stored grain. They had the kind of institutional inertia that sometimes survives when everything else burns. The brother brought Chen Yi to a monastery near Luoyang. The boy walked through gates that had kept out bandits and tax collectors alike, into a world of chanting and incense and, most importantly, meals that arrived with something resembling regularity. This is not the origin story the legends prefer. They like to imagine the future saint drawn to Buddhism by cosmic destiny, by an innate recognition of truth. The reality smells more like survival. The monastery was shelter from chaos, and the boy who would one day walk to India first learned that institutions can save your life, even when they cannot save your country. Outside the walls, the Tang dynasty was being born in blood and betrayal. Inside, a 10-year-old orphan was learning to chant sutras he did not yet understand. Chen Yi became Xuanzang at 13, which was technically illegal. Tang law required monks to be at least 20 before ordination, a rule designed to prevent monasteries from becoming dumping grounds for unwanted children and draft dodgers. Getting ordained younger required special imperial dispensation, the kind of exception that only happened when someone important noticed you. Someone important noticed. The boy's memory was unsettling. Not impressive, unsettling. Sutras that took other novices months to memorize, he absorbed in days. Complex philosophical arguments that senior monks still fumbled through. He could recite, and then, more troublingly, critique. By the time he was 20, Xuanzang had studied under virtually every major Buddhist teacher in China, traveling from monastery to monastery like a student transferring between universities, except each university kept running out of things to teach him. This should have been satisfying. Instead, it was maddening. The problem was not that Chinese Buddhism lacked texts. The problem was that it had too many, and they disagreed with each other constantly. The same sutra translated by different monks in different centuries said different things. Schools that claimed to represent the Buddha's true teaching contradicted each other on fundamental questions. Was consciousness real or illusory? Did enlightenment happen gradually or all at once? The answers depended entirely on which translation you happened to be reading. Xuanzang did what any obsessive scholar would do. He compared versions, traced lineages, checked citations. And he found something disturbing. The contradictions were not accidents. They were baked in. Chinese Buddhism had been built on translations made by people who sometimes did not fully understand the Sanskrit originals, who sometimes improvised, who sometimes filled gaps with guesswork and good intentions. The texts were corrupted, not by malice, but by distance. By centuries of copying and recopying, of translating through intermediate languages, of scholars doing their best with incomplete materials. The solution was obvious. Go to India. Get the originals. Learn Sanskrit properly. Bring back texts that could be trusted. The solution was also, legally speaking, punishable by death. The year is 629, and Emperor Taizong has just finished consolidating power through the traditional Tang method of killing his brothers. The Xuanwu Gate incident, as it would be politely called, left 2 princes dead and their father conveniently persuaded to abdicate. Taizong now sat on a throne still warm with family blood, which meant he was not in a mood to tolerate instability. The Silk Road was closed. Not officially, but practically. The Western Turks were restless. The oasis kingdoms along the route were unreliable. Chinese merchants who ventured west had a tendency to not come back, and the diplomatic situation was too fragile for anyone to go investigate why. Taizong had banned travel beyond the frontier on pain of death, and he meant it. Xuanzang submitted his petition anyway. He was polite about it. He explained his reasons. The Buddhist texts in China were inadequate, contradictory, potentially leading countless souls astray. The solution required traveling to India, the source. Surely the emperor, in his wisdom, could see the merit. The emperor, in his wisdom, said no. Not perhaps later. Not we will consider it. Just no. The monk was too valuable to lose in the desert. The political situation was too delicate. And besides, Chinese Buddhism was fine. It had been fine for centuries. What kind of arrogance suggested that one monk knew better than generations of translators? Xuanzang received the refusal with appropriate deference. He bowed. He withdrew. He went back to his monastery and began quietly selling his belongings. The decision had already been made. The emperor's refusal was an obstacle, not a conclusion. Xuanzang had studied enough philosophy to understand that some rules existed only until someone decided they did not. He found a horse. He packed sutras, dried provisions, and a water skin. He identified the sections of the frontier where guards were thinnest. And one night, while the capital slept, he simply left. Not as a pilgrim. Not as a hero. As a criminal slipping past border posts in darkness, knowing that if captured he would be executed not as a martyr for the faith, but as a common lawbreaker. There would be no special trial, no religious consideration. Just a blade, a hole in the ground, and a note in some bureaucrat's ledger. The monk who would become the most celebrated figure in Chinese Buddhist history began his journey as a fugitive. The Taklamakan Desert has a name that translates, depending on who you ask, to either place of no return or go in and you will not come out. The locals were not being poetic. They were being accurate. Xuanzang had hired a guide, a former bandit who knew the frontier paths. The guide lasted exactly long enough to get them past the last Tang outpost, then vanished in the night, apparently deciding that escorting a wanted criminal into the deadliest desert on Earth was not worth whatever payment had been promised. He took most of the supplies. What remained was a monk, a horse, and several days of travel before the next water source. The Taklamakan does not kill dramatically. It kills through accumulation. Sand worked its way into every fold of Xuanzang's robes, ground against his skin until it drew blood, filled his nostrils and ears and the corners of his eyes. The heat during the day was crushing, a physical weight that pressed down until breathing felt like labor. The cold at night was worse, dropping so fast that the sweat of the day became a crust of ice by midnight. Then Xuanzang spilled his water. The accounts do not specify how. Perhaps the horse stumbled. Perhaps the water skin had worn thin. Perhaps exhaustion made his hands clumsy. The cause does not matter. The result was water soaking into sand, disappearing in seconds, leaving behind only a damp patch that the sun would erase within the hour. 4 days without water. The human body can technically survive longer, but the human mind begins abandoning ship much sooner. By the 3rd day, Xuanzang was hallucinating. Demons, he would later write demons and spirits, though modern readers might recognize the particular madness of severe dehydration, the brain misfiring as it begins to shut down non-essential functions like correctly perceiving reality. His lips cracked and bled. His tongue swelled until speaking was impossible. His horse, somehow, kept walking. On the 4th day, the horse smelled something Xuanzang could not. It turned sharply, ignoring his feeble attempts to guide it, and dragged its nearly dead rider toward an oasis that he had not known existed. This is not the kind of story the hagiographers like to tell. A proper saint should be preserved by divine intervention, not by a horse's superior nose. But Xuanzang survived through animal instinct and dumb luck, collapsing at a spring he would have walked past, saved by a creature too stubborn to die when its rider had given up. He rested for a day, refilled his water, and continued west. The desert was not even half crossed. The oasis kingdoms of Central Asia had a reputation problem. Chinese officials called them barbarian territories, implying unwashed savages barely capable of civilization. Xuanzang, stumbling out of the desert more dead than alive, discovered this assessment was somewhat misleading. Turpan was his first shock. The kingdom maintained Buddhist monasteries with libraries that rivaled anything in Chang'an. The royal court conducted business in multiple languages, handled trade disputes with sophisticated legal codes, and patronized arts that would not have been out of place in the Tang capital. These barbarians had indoor plumbing. King Kuwen AI heard that a Chinese monk had crossed the Taklamakan alone and immediately summoned him. This was not curiosity. This was acquisition. Famous monks were prestige objects, proof of a kingdom's cultural sophistication. A Chinese Buddhist master who had survived the Death Desert would be quite a trophy. The king made his offer politely. Xuanzang would stay in Turpan as the royal chaplain, with a generous stipend, luxurious quarters, and all the resources he needed for scholarship. In exchange, he would simply not leave. Xuanzang declined. The king suggested that perhaps the monk had not understood. This was not a request. Xuanzang stopped eating. The hunger strike lasted 4 days. It was not spiritual drama. It was calculated leverage. A dead monk was worthless as a prestige object, and Xuanzang was clearly prepared to become worthless rather than compliant. The king, recognizing that he was dealing with someone as stubborn as himself, relented with unusual grace. Not only would Xuanzang be allowed to leave, he would leave wealthy. Kuwent AI provided gold, silk, letters of introduction to every ruler along the Silk Road, and a retinue of servants to carry it all. The monk who had entered the kingdom as a half-dead fugitive departed as a diplomat. Word traveled faster than feet. By the time Xuanzang reached Kucha, then Samarkand, then the mountain passes into India, his reputation preceded him. The mad monk who crossed the Taklamakan. The scholar who defied an emperor. The holy man so committed to his mission he would rather die than be comfortable. Back in China, he was still a criminal. Out here, he was becoming a legend. Nalanda was not a monastery. It was a city that happened to be populated entirely by monks. 10,000 students at its peak, housed in buildings that stretched across the horizon, studying subjects that ranged from Buddhist philosophy to medicine to astronomy to the kind of logic that could reduce a grown man to tears of frustration. The complex had its own hospitals, its own libraries, its own system of examination so rigorous that most applicants failed the entrance interview and went home. Xuanzang arrived after years of travel, having crossed deserts, mountains, and kingdoms that would not exist a century later. He carried letters of introduction from kings. He had debated scholars in courts across Central Asia. He had survived things that should have killed him several times over. Nalanda did not care. He was given a small room, a modest allowance, and a place among the thousands of other students who had also traveled impossible distances to be here. The prodigy who had exhausted every teacher in China was suddenly a beginner again, struggling to keep up with lectures delivered in Sanskrit he could barely follow, surrounded by monks who had been studying these texts their entire lives. The abbot was Shilabhedra, a man so old and respected that his name had become a title. He was also dying, slowly, of a disease that had him constantly in pain. When Xuanzang finally gained an audience, Shilabhedra wept. He had been waiting, he said. A dream had told him that a student would come from China, someone who would carry the true teaching back to the East. He had stayed alive specifically for this. Xuanzang studied for 5 years. The curriculum was Yogacara philosophy, a school that argued consciousness was the fundamental reality, that the world we perceive is constructed by mind rather than existing independently. In China, this teaching existed only in fragments, badly translated, contradicted by other schools. Here at the source, Xuanzang learned it properly. He learned not just the texts, but the commentaries. Not just the commentaries, but the debates. Not just the debates, but the precise Sanskrit terms that had been mangled into nonsense by generations of well-meaning Chinese translators. He also learned humility, though the hagiographies rarely mention this. Being the smartest person in every room is a comfortable identity. Sitting in lectures where the material exceeds your comprehension, surrounded by students who handle it easily, is less comfortable. Xuanzang spent 5 years being reminded that knowing more than anyone in China did not mean knowing enough. By the time he finished, he had mastered what he came for. He had also accumulated something he had not expected: a reputation that extended across India. The great debate at Kannauj was King Harsh's idea. Harsha ruled most of northern India, patronized Buddhism with the enthusiasm of a man trying to prove something, and enjoyed spectacles that demonstrated his cultural sophistication. A debate between the greatest scholars of multiple traditions, presided over by royalty, attended by thousands, seemed exactly the kind of thing that would cement his legacy. Xuanzang was invited to defend a thesis. The format was traditional and terrifying. The challenger would present his position. Anyone who disagreed could step forward and argue against it. If the challenger's position was defeated, he would face consequences ranging from public humiliation to, in extreme cases, execution. Xuanzang, presumably feeling that his life had not contained enough near-death experiences, agreed to terms that specified beheading if he lost. The thesis was technical, concerning the nature of consciousness and its relationship to external reality. It drew on Yogacara philosophy, the school he had spent 5 years mastering. But the audience would include scholars from every Buddhist school, plus Hindus, Jains, and logicians who believed in nothing but the purity of argument. The debate lasted 18 days. 18 days of scholars presenting objections, trying to find logical flaws, attempting to trap Xuanzang in contradictions. 18 days of the Chinese monk responding in Sanskrit on Indian ground, by Indian rules, defending positions that represented not just his own understanding but centuries of philosophical tradition. No one defeated him. This was not a polite academic exercise where everyone went home with participation trophies. The scholars who came to challenge Xuanzang were serious, and some of them were brilliant. They had spent their lives studying these questions. They knew the texts, the counterarguments, the subtle logical traps that could destroy a position in seconds. Xuanzang survived because he had prepared for exactly this, because he understood not just the philosophy but the metagame of formal debate, because 5 years at Nalanda had taught him things that could not be learned anywhere in China. King Harsha was delighted. He offered Xuanzang permanent residency, unlimited funding, a position of honor in his court. Other rulers made similar offers. The foreign monk had proven himself beyond question. He could stay in India forever, revered and comfortable. Xuanzang declined. He had come for texts, and he now had 657 of them. The journey was not over. It was time to go home. The year is 645. 16 years have passed since a monk slipped past border guards in darkness, a wanted criminal fleeing toward almost certain death in the desert. Now that same monk approaches Chang'an with a caravan that would make a merchant weep with envy. 22 horses loaded with manuscripts, relics, statues, and seeds from trees sacred to Buddhism. 657 texts, more Buddhist scripture than had ever entered China at once. And one extremely uncertain monk who technically remained guilty of a capital crime. Xuanzang sent a message ahead. The wording was careful, almost legalistic. He acknowledged that he had left without permission. He acknowledged that the penalty for this was death. He asked, essentially, whether he should present himself for execution or whether circumstances had perhaps changed. Emperor Taizong's response arrived with the kind of speed that suggested he had been waiting for this. The circumstances had very much changed. An honor guard was dispatched to escort Xuanzang into the capital. The man who had been banned from leaving was now invited to return with full imperial ceremony. The reason was not forgiveness. The reason was logistics. Taizong had spent the intervening years expanding the Tang dynasty into Central Asia, conducting exactly the kind of Western campaigns that made accurate information about the region invaluable. He had also been consolidating power through Buddhism, using monastic networks as tools of soft power. A monk who had walked through every kingdom between China and India, who had mapped routes and recorded customs and made contacts with rulers across the Silk Road, was suddenly more valuable than any punishment could be satisfying. And then there were the texts. 657 original Sanskrit manuscripts, representing Buddhist philosophy as it existed at the source, uncorrupted by centuries of translation errors. The same emperor who had dismissed the need for Indian originals now desperately wanted them. Xuanzang entered Chang'an through crowds so thick that the official welcoming ceremony had to be postponed. The people who gathered were not there for politics. They were there because word had spread of miracles of a monk who survived deserts and mountains and debates where death was the penalty for losing. The hagiography was already being written, whether Xuanzang wanted it or not. The border guards who would have killed him on the way out now bowed as he passed. Xuanzang spent the next 19 years translating. Not studying, not contemplating, not enjoying the fame that would have permitted a comfortable retirement. Translating with the relentless intensity of someone who understood that he would die before the work was finished if he slowed down. The emperor built him a pagoda. The giant wild goose pagoda still stands in Xi'an, a tower specifically constructed to house the manuscripts Xuanzang brought back. It remains one of the most recognizable Buddhist structures in China, visited by tourists who rarely know why it exists or who built it or what it was meant to protect. Inside, Xuanzang worked. He supervised teams of assistants, dictated translations, compared versions, argued about terminology. The Sanskrit term dharma alone required weeks of debate to translate properly. Every word mattered because the entire point of the journey had been to produce texts that could be trusted, texts that would not contradict each other, texts that future scholars could build upon with confidence. He completed 1,335 scrolls, more than any other single translator in Chinese Buddhist history, before or since. The scale is almost incomprehensible. Each scroll required understanding the Sanskrit original, identifying the philosophical context, choosing Chinese terms that captured the meaning without distortion, then dictating and revising until the result met his standards. He did this over and over, year after year, until his body simply gave out. He also wrote, "The Great Tang Records on the Western regions was not a religious text, but a geographical one, a detailed account of every kingdom, every route, every custom he had observed during his travels. Modern archaeologists still use it. Cities that vanished beneath sand centuries ago have been located using Xuanzang's directions. He was, among everything else, an accidental historian of civilizations that would otherwise be completely lost. Xuanzang died in 664 at 62 years old, exhausted in the way that only comes from decades of work that never felt finished. His funeral drew mourners from across the empire. Monks, officials, and ordinary people who had never met him but who understood, somehow, that something irreplaceable had been lost. His legacy is not monuments or miracles. His legacy is that Chinese Buddhism finally had texts it could trust. The originals were here now, translated by someone who had learned Sanskrit at the source, who had studied under masters who knew what the words actually meant. The centuries of contradiction and confusion did not end overnight, but they had a new foundation. Every time someone breaks the rules to get something everyone wants, then gets celebrated for the exact rebellion they were punished for, they are walking Xuanzang's route. The emperor who banned travel to India built a pagoda to house what that travel produced. The border guards who would have executed an outbound criminal bowed to an inbound saint. The difference between the two was not repentance or redemption. The difference was that Xuanzang came back with something useful. The rules became flexible precisely when flexibility served power, and not a moment sooner. He understood this. The translations prove it. He worked until he died, knowing that the same empire that celebrated him had been perfectly willing to kill him. Institutions can save your life, he had learned at 10 years old. They can also end it. The trick is making yourself too valuable to destroy. The giant wild goose pagoda still stands. The texts are still read. And somewhere, in some archive, there is probably still a record from 629 marking a monk named Xuanzang as a fugitive from imperial law.